Hello everyone. Today I'll show you one of the most intense and tactically crazy time pressure games ever played, a Norway chess battle between Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen. According to the time control, Hikaru Nakamura, playing white, had 10 minutes, while Magnus Carlsen, with the black pieces, had only 7. However, Magnus only needed a draw or a win to take the match, while Hikaru absolutely had to win. We'll watch this game from Hikaru's perspective, playing as white, fighting only for victory. Hikaru begins the game with the move d4, and Magnus replies with knight f6. c4, grabbing space in the center, and Magnus immediately strikes back, knight c3, dx c4, and Hikaru recaptures on d5, while Magnus takes back with the pawn. The dark squared bishop from white comes out aggressively to g5, pinning the knight to the queen on d8. Magnus quickly breaks this pin and prepares short castling. e3, white solidifies the center and prepares to develop the bishop. Magnus then challenges the bishop on g5, and after being attacked, it retreats to h4. Black develops the light-squared bishop. Now, white faces a tricky decision. Playing bishop e2 would simply lead to an exchange of bishops, so Hikaru chooses f3, reinforcing control over the e4 square and preparing the central break e4 supported by this pawn. Magnus retreats his bishop to e6, and white develops his bishop to d3, slightly behind in development. Black, however, delays castling and instead aggressively challenges the center with c5, striking at white's pawn structure. White plays knight e2, reinforcing the center and completing development, preparing to castle. Magnus develops his final knight to c6, putting full pressure on the center. Eventually, white castles kingside and black follows suit. Hikaru brings his rook to the e-file. Rook e8 mirrors the move. After some thought, white repositions his bishop to c2, eyeing potential kingside attacking plans, perhaps capturing the knight on f6 and forming a deadly bishop-queen battery aimed at black's king. Magnus centralizes his second rook, bringing it into play. Now both rooks support the idea of opening the position with an eventual exchange on d4. Meanwhile, white begins to increase pressure in the center. The white knight jumps to f4, attacking the bishop on e6. Carlsen, ever resourceful, finds tactical opportunities. He captures on d4, and after knight takes e6, Hikaru interposes with a counterattack, taking the bishop and simultaneously hitting the queen. Magnus recaptures with the pawn on e6, and white captures the pawn on d4. After this series of exchanges, Magnus is left with a weak pawn on e6, already under fire. But the world champion continues his tactical play, capturing with the knight on d4, winning a pawn in the process. Capturing this knight with the queen is not possible because then bishop c5 would deliver a discovered attack on the white king on g1, and the queen would be lost. Therefore, taking the knight is simply out of the question. But the speed chess demon, Hikaru Nakamura, calculated this position a little deeper than the world champion. He plays bishop g6, and suddenly, too many of Carlsen's pieces are hanging in the center. The rook on e8 now needs to move, and in some lines, the knight on d4 becomes a target. After that, the e6 pawn could collapse as well, and the d5 pawn would no longer look so strong. Magnus Carlsen, already playing with a time handicap, spends another minute thinking and finds the only move, rook f8. The clocks show, Magnus has 4 minutes and 30 seconds, while Hikaru has 9 minutes and 20 seconds, more than twice as much time. The position is extremely unclear. In this tense moment, Hikaru finds another brilliant move, bishop f2. Now the knight on d4 is directly under attack, and white simply threatens to capture it. The dark knight has no choice but to retreat, and immediately the e6 pawn falls. Hikaru captures it with rook takes e6, and suddenly white's pieces are tying down black's entire position. Magnus clearly dislikes this. His d5 pawn is also weak, but he tries to turn that weakness into strength by advancing, d4, kicking the white knight and pushing in the center. The white knight retreats to e2, and now the d4 pawn is truly hanging, attacked 3 times and defended only twice, by the queen and the knight. Magnus plays bishop c5, adding another defender and keeping the pawn alive for now. But white continues to increase pressure. The knight jumps to f4, joining the forces on the kingside. Magnus decides it's time to trade some pieces to ease the tension. He centralizes his knight to d5, attacking the white knight. However, Magnus overlooks the weaknesses on the light squares around his king. They're extremely vulnerable. In just 20 seconds, Hikaru finds the best continuation, queen b3. A deadly X-ray attack, pinning the knight on d5 to Carlsen's king. Magnus has no good options. there's nothing better than giving up the queen. If, for instance, he captures on f4 with the rook, white plays rook e8+, and no matter what happens, the black queen falls. Magnus tries to be clever and takes with the knight on f4, allowing white a discovered check. Hikaru plays rook d6+, a crushing discovered attack on the black king. There's no good way to block the check without losing even more material, so Magnus must retreat his king. After that, rook takes d8, and the queen is gone. But, being the world champion in rapid and blitz, Magnus manages to find counterplay. For his lost queen, he now has a rook, a knight, and a dangerous passed pawn on the d-file, which is quickly turning into a real threat. However, the clock is a disaster for Magnus, only 2 minutes and 30 seconds against 7 minutes for Hikaru. After a minute of thought, Hikaru plays takes b7, grabbing another pawn. Now even the knight on c6 is under attack. Magnus moves it to e5, attacking the bishop on g6 again. The bishop calmly retreats to e4, solidifying white's control of the center. Magnus instinctively repositions his bishop to b6, where it's nicely protected by the a7 pawn. a4. Hikaru wants to play a5 next and chase that chicken, as commentators might joke, off its perch on b6. But Magnus doesn't allow it just yet. He places his knight on c4. Now, if white plays a5, black will simply capture that pawn with the knight. Hikaru continues with queen a6, putting pressure on the knight, which suddenly becomes loose. Magnus responds with knight d2, counterattacking the bishop on e4. Now Hikaru needs to move that bishop somewhere, otherwise, black's counterplay in the center could become very dangerous. Nakamura uses the tempo cleverly. First, he pushes a5, attacking Magnus' bishop on b6. The bishop is forced to retreat to c5 and white's bishop steps back even farther to b7, keeping an eye on the long diagonal. Then comes knight b3, attacking the rook and clearing the way for black's passed pawn to advance. Hikaru immediately plays rook d1, of course, to control the d-file and the dangerous black pawn. But Magnus pushes forward anyway, d3. The pawn is now just 2 steps away from promotion, though white's rook is blocking it for now. Hikaru exchanges bishops on c5 and after knight takes c5, there's a fork on the queen and the white bishop. But white counters with queen takes a7, grabbing the pawn and creating his own dangerous passed pawn on the a-file. Magnus recaptures with bishop takes b7, and after the exchange, follows up with rook e8, perfect centralization of his pieces. Now the black knight on f4 is an absolute monster, hovering menacingly over white's position and keeping an eye on the promotion square. The black rooks perfectly control the key d and e files. Objectively, in a slower, classical time control, the position should still be winning for white thanks to the 2 passed pawns and the potential support of the queen, but in this insane time scramble, anything can happen. Hikaru clearly dislikes Magnus' knight. It looks like an eagle soaring above white's position. So he decides to drive it away with g3. And now, in this wild time pressure, let's switch to the players' cameras and follow the game as it unfolds in real time. Incredibly, after thinking for just 10 seconds, Magnus Carlsen sacrifices his knight on f4 and plays d2, the strongest move in the position. The point is simple but deadly. If white captures the knight, then follows rook e1, taking the rook on d1 and queening the pawn. Hikaru is now completely puzzled. What can he do to stop rook e1, which is an immediate threat? In this position, the only winning move is an inhuman resource, king f1. The idea is that after knight d5, threatening a fork, white can simply capture on d2 with the king. And after knight e3, there is just one legal move that saves the game, king e1, protecting the rook. Yes, the white king steps right into potential discovered checks, but as the computer shows, it's still safe. For example, after knight g2, simply king d1, and on rook e1, the king escapes. Hikaru, under immense pressure, finds the second only saving move, queen b4, covering the e1 square and preventing the rook check. Now, if needed, white can capture twice on d2 safely, but Magnus immediately responds with lightning speed, rook d4, sacrificing his rook on d4 to keep the initiative alive. The key point here is that capturing the pawn is impossible. If white takes it, black plays knight e2, forking the king and the queen. Once again, the only way for white to survive is to sacrifice the queen for black's dangerous passed pawn. Hikaru finds this move, Magnus captures, and then rook takes follows. Now Magnus' knight is hanging and must retreat, knight e6, and we reach what should be a theoretically drawn position. The reason is simple. Black's knight perfectly supports the rook in stopping white's passed pawns. The knight will soon reposition to the queenside c5, c7, b4, helping hold everything together. Magnus centralizes his king while Hikaru begins pushing his queenside pawns, trying to create counterplay. Rook a8. Magnus attacks the pawn on a5. Hikaru must defend it. He can't afford to lose pawns because a draw equals victory for Magnus Carlsen in this playoff format. Hikaru shakes his head. He realizes Magnus might sacrifice his knight for 2 pawns to secure a draw. Rook a2. Hikaru defends the pawn while Magnus keeps marching his king toward the center. The black pawns can't move yet. If the a7 pawn pushes, knight c7 will immediately attack it. Hikaru brings his king closer to king e7. Magnus centralizes. Hikaru spots a small tactical idea, b6, threatening b7 next. Black reacts precisely with knight c5, blocking the pawn. Now b7 is impossible. King e3 and then king d6, defending the knight. Meanwhile, Hikaru's king races toward the kingside to devour black's pawns while Magnus is distracted on the queenside. g6. Magnus locks the position, stopping the white king's entry. h4. Hikaru wants to break through with h5 and open a path for his king. Magnus doesn't have a clear plan and centralizes to d5. Hikaru doesn't rush h5 right away. If he does, black will just capture, so he plays king g4 first. Magnus keeps dancing with his king around his knight, and now h5, finally breaking through. Rook g8, Magnus reinforces his g6 pawn. The clock situation is critical, only 2 seconds left for Magnus Carlsen. Hikaru plays rook c2, pinning the knight. King b5, Magnus tries to advance, but then white captures on g6. After a check, king h5, and now the black rook is hanging. Magnus doesn't have time to move, his flag falls. An absolutely insane time scramble. Magnus defended a brutally tough position to the very last seconds and was just 1 move away from the draw, which would have won him the match. But he fell short by literally 1 second, even the increment couldn't save him. After the game, Hikaru apologized to Magnus, saying he didn't want to win like that, but in chess, time is part of the game. In the final position, the idea was that Magnus wanted to take the pawn on g3, forcing a draw. For example, if white captures on a6, then black simply takes on f3, and the black king and knight perfectly control white's pawns. After a few checks and exchanges, the position becomes completely equal. Even if black sacrifices his knight, both sides end up with 1 rook each and a dead draw. Magnus was literally 1 step away from victory, and yet so far. If you enjoyed this game, don't forget to like the video and comment below. Have you ever lost a game in time trouble like this? Thanks for watching, see you soon.